about your book.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I know it's a long day and 4 o'clock is like sleepy time, right? So I appreciate it. I might stand up and walk around, but I want to be able to show something from the computer in a little bit. So I want to thank Isabel Espinal for actually suggesting to CLACLS and other folks at UMass that the book talk be sponsored. I really appreciate that. And of course the CLACLS and the Study of Women and Gender department here at UMass for hosting me. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about the genesis of the project, or of Los Gemelos, as we have now, who had an elephant birth. They took a very long time to gestate and actually appear in the world. So we could really name the origins in some way in the conference that I organized in 2003 in Santo Domingo when I was a Fulbright there for the first time, in collaboration with the Centro de Estudio de Género, the Center for Gender Studies at INTEC, where after several months of doing that Fulbright and going to libraries and archives and bookstores throughout Santo Domingo, I was surprised that there was very little actually being published about gender or women's studies in Santo Domingo, given that the center itself was one of the first center for gender studies in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and that I knew personally and professionally that they had been publishing articles and work and so forth. So I didn't understand why, when I showed up at bookstores and libraries and the archives and asked for text, that things didn't come to mind for people, and that there wasn't apparently a scholarly publications tradition yet. So with Lulu Contreras, who's the director of the center, we organized a day-long conference, the first of its kind on gender studies in the Dominican Republic. And we had over 20 presenters and over 150 attendees. So clearly there was interest, clearly there was scholarship. And about a year or two later, with FLACSO, la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, and CEG, the Centro de Estudio de Género, I published the first collection called Miradas Desencadenantes. And from there, CEG then continued to do conferences every year or two and to publish the proceedings of that conference. So picking up on that, April Mays, my friend and colleague from Pomona College, who's a historian, when she went and did her Fulbright in 2009-10, she also organized the conference, and then a second follow-up conference in 2011 that she called Intercambiando Historias, los estudios de género y feminismo en la República Dominicana. And I was one of the, I think there were 12 of us, 16 of us, who presented over the course of 2 days in two places, in la Academia Dominicana de Historia, which is traditionally a very male bastion. In fact, the first woman historian wasn't admitted into the academia until just a couple of years ago. Okay, and now, this year, the first woman president of the academia was named, so that is historic in and of itself. But this was very much a very male space in terms of the membership, but also in terms of the historiography, right? It's a very masculinist, androcentric historiography in the Dominican Republic. So April organized the conference there, really wanting to enter that space and begin to transform it a little bit by bringing women's scholarship, women's history into this space specifically. Her other major partner was the Instituto Pedro Bono, named for the first Dominican sociologist. It is a progressive/left Jesuit seminary that has done amazing work training intellectuals and social justice activists in the Dominican Republic. So that was also very purposeful in terms of signaling the kind of progressive nature of doing women's history and feminist history, specifically in Santo Domingo. So there we were, the second day of this Intercambiando Historia Seminario at the Instituto Bono, actually, which, unlike the first day, drew not only historians and scholars and academics, but also drew community activists ranging from young women who were involved in a series of different feminist movements in the Dominican Republic, culture workers, artists, as well as organic intellectuals, and people like Magali Pineda. How many of you have heard of Magali Pineda? Great, okay. Magali Pineda, for those of you who don't know, was one of the most well-known Dominican feminists. She's sort of the Dominican Gloria Steinem, if you want, the U.S. framework.
She would die.
Yes. Right, except for the CIA connection. Right? She was, an inspirational person who had many decades of organizing experience, but also of feminist scholarship. She was the founder of the Centro para Investigación para la Acción Femenina in la República Dominicana. So Magali was there at this meeting, and at the end of the day, almost at the last panel, she stands up and she says, "This is wonderful that all of you have come from the United States." And by the way, most of us were of Dominican heritage, right? Either Dominican born and raised and then trained in terms of our PhDs in the US, or second generation Dominican Americans, people like me, the children of immigrants and exiles. Not exclusively, but many of us. And she says, it's wonderful that you're doing this research. It's wonderful especially to see Dominican women and Dominican American women doing this research. But it's a little frustrating to know that you have access to these archives, these materials, this patrimonio nacional, that we ourselves here have not been able to access. Where did you get this stuff that you are basing your papers and presentations and research projects on? And the answer was largely the Dominican Republic, but not exclusively. The materials are actually being drawn from archives throughout the Americas and Europe as well. And Magali, true to form, says, well, it must be nice to have a kind of institutional backing and funding that permits you to go to all those archives and to collect that information and to write these projects, which we need, but there's something fundamentally wrong about that, right? And given the history of imperialism, right, and U.S.-Dominican relations, and of colonialism and scholarship, right? So Magali nos retó, right? She very much sort of laid down a gauntlet and insisted that we, respond to this claim. Hola, Luis. So I want to show you very quickly before I go on to talk about the book, a short video about Magali, because she asked the question, she posed the challenge. April Mays and I took it on and decided that same month, that same trip in Santo Domingo, to go ahead and conceptualize a project and propose it to the Archivo General de la Nación Dominicana. Thinking about the fact that we could have easily proposed it to Flaxo or to INTEC, which would have, we're sure, happily taken the project on and published it. But in keeping with the spirit of April's Intercambiando Historias organizing mission of having this at the Academia Dominicana de Historia, this male bastion, we wanted to go to the other major bastion of male prerogative in terms of history making and archival collections, which was the Archivo General de la Nación. So we went ahead and wrote the proposal, submitted it to the AGN, and after a series of conversations, both in person and email and by phone, they finally agreed to do it and signed the contract. We didn't imagine that it would take 5 years from the point of signing the contract to actually having the book, but it did. I'll tell you a little bit about those 5 years, but before I do, I want to signal that I was in Santo Domingo literally doing the final copy edits to the page proofs at the AGN in the Área de Publicaciones the day that Magali Pineda's death was announced in Santo Domingo on March 29th, 2016. So she never got to see the book, which came out just 2 months later, less than 2 months later, 6 weeks. But she did get to know that she had inspired it and that it would be dedicated to her. So it is. And I'd like to just share with you, if you allow me, a short film that was posted in El Diario Libre as part of her obituary, because I would like to honor and recognize that she inspired this. as I said, the original proposers of the project were myself and April Mays. I am not a historian. I'm trained as a sociologist. In fact, Agustina and I went to the same graduate program at CUNY. However, the program that we were trained by is highly interdisciplinary, I think you would agree, and encouraged us to take classes beyond the sociology department in the pursuit of answers to or methodologies or tools for undertaking our particular research projects. And I think that certainly informed my first book project, which was Black Behind the Ears, and prepared me to undertake more explicitly archival and historiographic work, which is what Cien años is a product of. So April, I think, was willing to collaborate with me as a historian for that reason. Also because I am somewhat senior to April. I'm about 10 years ahead of her on the track. And we began with the idea, and what we proposed to the AGN is that it would be 2 volumes, probably about 250 to 300 pages each, for a total of about 600 to 800 pages. Covering roughly 100 years, we thought 1861 or so, 65 to about 1961, 65. So we began the work in the summer of 2012. A little bit before that, we conferred about the archives that we personally had collected. We also reached out to a few other of the scholars who attended that first seminar and asked them if they had anything that they'd like to contribute to the project in terms of archival materials related to the history of women's movements and feminism in the Dominican Republic. By the end of the 6 weeks that we spent together that first summer in the June of 2012, we came to realize a couple of things. One was that it would definitely surpass the 200 to 300 page framework that we had anticipated. Because as we began to find the originals to documents that we had either transcribed or photocopied or eventually taken pictures of, because I myself began collecting some of these materials in 2001. April began collecting right around the same time, 2003 and 4. The Archivo General de la Nación that we entered to do that collecting process literally at the time had no computer system, had a paper catalog system, and basically relied on the mental catalog sustained by a man named Campito. His nickname was Campito. Campito was the catalog. Okay? So a lot of the collecting that went, and it had one photocopier, a tabletop photocopier, the kind you may have seen, 25, 30 years ago. So when you would show up in the early 2000s, the AGN, to try and find something, you'd approach Campito and you'd say, hola Campito, ¿cómo está usted? Ay, muy bien. Mire Campito, ¿usted se recuerda de algo que tiene que ver con la historia de la mujer en Santo Domingo? And he'd go like this, déjame ver, and then he'd go to the back and he'd appear with something. Right, and he'd give it to you and say, no, es escrito por una mujer, sobre la historia de la mujer, and you'd go through this process, right? So, by the time we proposed the project, however, in 2011, in those 10 years, a great deal had changed in the AGN, not least of which was that it went from being an exclusively political appointment, usually held by right-wing neo-Trujillistas like Juan Bernard, who was actually a functionary of the Trujillo regime, to actually being a serious intellectual appointment, exemplified by the directorship of Roberto Casá, who's an actual historian, who was one of the first actual historians to hold that position. So when Professor Casá took over the AGN, he did a series of things. One was that he actually militarized the AGN. He had the military police come and guard the entrance to the research room and the archives. This was a response to the fact that prior to his directorship, documents were routinely sold to researchers, often researchers from outside the United States, by AGN workers, or were purged by people like Juan Bernard, who liberally would cut things out or censor them and return them to the archive as he saw fit if they offered evidence of a history that went counter to the official story of the Dominican Republic. So in this instance, having an actual military police presence was a way of democratizing, if you can believe that, and preserving some of the integrity of the archives. He also contracted with a series of archival historical entities throughout the Americas, from places like Argentina, primarily in Mexico, but also from Spain, to undertake actual training in archival methods, preservation and collection methods, cataloging methods, etc. He computerized the archives, and he contracted, and this was a little more controversial, with the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, to begin to digitize the archives, because as you may know, the Mormons go all over the world digitizing genealogical records. Did you not know that? They're behind Ancestry.com, and they have been involved in almost every archival project throughout the Americas, because they have a retroactive salvation policy. So that's a whole other conversation. So they go around and they make arrangements with places like the AGN, and what they did in that case is that they literally brought the digitizing equipment, they left it, and they trained the AGN
retroactive
staff.
salvation, you mean I can, like,
If you become a Mormon, all the people before you will become Mormons.
Oh.
So in order to do that, they need to know your genealogical record.
Jeez,
Yeah.
amazing.
So they will track you all the way back to wherever, España or Arabia, or wherever your gente may have come from. So, Casa and the PLD, which was the government that appointed him, contracted this with the Church of Latter-day Saints and began the process of digitizing the archives, both the catalog but also actual holdings, which in fact has been incredibly democratizing as well, whatever issues we may have with the other implications of that. All of which is to say that suddenly, when we appeared in 2012, first we went with the idea that we would relocate a series of documents that April and I had identified as being sort of critical for inclusion, right? And many, but actually not all of those, were located at that point. Some of them disappeared, right? And luckily we did have a PDF of some kind or a photocopy. But more interestingly, all of a sudden things that we didn't know might be there began to appear as well, because now we had a searchable database of some kind, and now we were relying on more than just Campido's, memory. Que paz descanse, because he also passed away. So Volume 1 is actually dedicated to him. So that was one thing. The other thing was that we began to realize that we ourselves, April and I, who had focused primarily in the 19th and early 20th century, because the book I was working on was really trying to understand the history before suffrage. Suffrage is granted by Trujillo in 1942. The common story, including in Dominican historiography, is that Trujillo gave women the vote only for his own agenda, in terms of sort of co-opting women as yet more members of the spectacle of Trujillismo and of support for the dictator and so on and so forth. There's a certain truth to that, but it actually erases the 60 years of organizing that happened before the vote by feminists in the Dominican Republic. So we began to realize, though, that April and I personally did not have enough in our own archives, nor did we really know where in the AGNs or other privately held archives throughout the DR we might access more information about the Trujillato and about the period immediately after the Trujillato, from 61 to 63, before Juan Bosch comes into the presidency. So at that point, we invited Elizabeth Manley, who's a historian of the 20th century and who herself was working on a book that's about to come out, by the way, University of Florida Press, on feminism under Trujillo and during Balaguer. So from Trujillo to the first 12 years of the Balaguerato, and in particular the gobernadoras of Balaguer. So Beth joined the project in 2013. What you'll see in the book is that April and Beth and I are co-editors of the whole project, but actually it's April and I who worked on Volume 1 and Beth and I who worked on Volume 2, which brings me to the process. April is in California, Beth is in New Orleans, and I'm in Massachusetts. in terms of our permanent affiliations. Along the way of the subsequent 3.5 to 4 years, any one of us could have also been in Paris, Córdoba, Sevilla, Madrid, Andalucía, Ciudad Mexico, Buenos Aires, La Habana, Puerto Príncipe, etc., right? So very little of the work that we did while we were in the US actually took place face-to-face. A lot of the work we did was through technologies like Skype, Dropbox, Google Docs, those three primarily, which is how we met and how we would compile and sort through our documents to actually edit the collection. From time to time each year, however, teams of 2 of us, and very rarely the 3 of us, would actually meet in Santo Domingo, or during one of the meetings of the National Women's Studies Association, the Berkshire Women's History Association, or the Latin American Studies Association, to try to do some face-to-face work, particularly in terms of writing the 2 introductions. That was largely when we did try to make sure that we were working together in person. Nonetheless, despite the use of technology and having to work across geographical and temporal divides, we did manage to produce the 2 full manuscripts and have them submitted to the AGN by the fall of 2013 for one volume and 2014 for the other. However, despite the consistency offered by Professor Casas, there was constant turnover and of staff and directorship in the publications area of the AGN. So we would leave the manuscript, we would be told in 3 or 4 months we would have page proofs, we'd leave, we'd come back, and nothing would have happened. Okay? The manuscript would literally be collecting dust on someone's table because el director had left or been reassigned to somewhere else in the AGN. So it was a very long and difficult process, and in fact, I think I can say safely that if it wasn't because I actually spent the first 5 months of this year in Santo Domingo at the AGN working in the publicaciones area, that it might not have even happened at that point, because I literally had to go day in and day out for about 6 weeks straight to make sure that progress was being made on the project and to do things like copy editing. In fairness, part of that had to do with the scope of the project. Between the 2 volumes, there are 1,555 pages. There are over 1,000 documents that we collected and compiled and organized. We decided to organize the 2 volumes thematically, 8 themes for each volume, themes that came from the history and the texts themselves. What are the texts? Everything from letters, pamphlets, large number of publications in newspapers. Actually, it was a substantial share of the material. Public secondary publication of already published work, particularly for things like poetry or short story or essay, analytical essay, as well as legislation and government documents are in the 2 volumes. We organized Volume 1 from 1865 to 1931. 31, as you may know, is the year when Trujillo assumes power officially in the Dominican Republic. 1865, as you may not know, is the beginning of the Second Republic. It's when the War of Restoration ends after the Spanish are kicked out for the second time from Santo Domingo, and you have the rise of liberalism in the Dominican Republic. So we can say, with the evidence that we have, that feminism was born with liberalism in the Dominican Republic. And I will say something more about the significance of that in a moment. So from 65 to 31, when Trujillo assumes power, it's about 65 years, 66 years. There is a long and sustained history of women who call themselves feminists, by the way, which was one of the major findings. These women did not call themselves suffragists. They used the word feminista, beginning in the 1880s. And they explicitly wrote about women as political subjects and as citizens, right, by the 1860s, when we begin to collect the documents of Socorro de Rosario Sanchez, who was the sister of one of the three founding fathers of the Patria. Okay. 31 is a watershed moment. So we end volume 1 in 31 and we include documents from 31. We begin volume 2 in 31 and we include documents from 31 as well. One of the documents is in both volumes, and it's the Manifesto of the AFD, the Acción Feminista Dominicana. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to signal that this moment of rupture between what came before Trujillo and what comes after Trujillo is also a moment in which feminism is beginning to shift in the Dominican Republic, in part because of the Trujillato, but not exclusively. You'll notice that volume 1 is smaller than volume 2. This makes sense because 65 to 31, you're really talking about a small number of women who were very prolific, amazingly so, but still limited in number. You're talking about a different technological and economic moment in the Dominican Republic, right? Access to things like printing and the preservation of materials from that era, very challenging, very difficult. And in fact, I think it's safe to say that the majority of women's history archives in the DR are not at the Archivo General de la Nación. They're held privately, literally in people's garages. Okay, no attics in Santo Domingo, but there are, marquesinas in folks' garages and private libraries and private offices, right? So in terms of what's actually in the AGN, it's a much more limited number. By contrast, the Trujillato, one of the things that distinguished the regime was precisely its structure of producing propaganda, but also knowledge and a record of itself, a record of the regime, right? So there was much more to be culled, for example, from governmental publications, but also from the newspapers, which I'll say a word about. Finally, we also made an effort, and again, it's somewhat hamstrung, but we did make an effort to collect materials from women in exile, the women who left the Santo Domingo during the Trujillato, and were writing from places like San Juan, Puerto Rico, Havana, Cuba, Mexico City, and of course New York, right? So some of their materials are there as well. So what is the significance of the project as I see it and as was indicated to me and my co-editors when the book was published, which was on June 17th, by the way, of this year. So we had the official publication, like literally hot off the presses. They brought it that morning, the presentación del libro was that evening. There was, to the last minute possibility that it wouldn't show up from the actual printing press, but it did. Over 350 people showed up for the presentación del libro. From our understanding, it was the most highly attended book launch in the history of the AGN. And this was really significant, given that it's one of the few books of women's history published by the AGN, which historically has only published books by and about men in the Dominican Republic, still today. So there was a tremendous amount of public interest in the book itself. In addition, the three of us, again, either together or in dyads, did a series of television and radio and print interviews throughout the week before and in the weeks after the publication of the book, indicating a broad public interest in a book that was offering evidence of 100 years of feminism in the Dominican Republic, right, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. Among the things that we were told was that folks were beginning to recognize the book or read the book as an intervention into contemporary issues related to women's rights, in particular violence against women, in particular gay and lesbian rights in the DR, and in particular women's involvements in the birthright citizenship crisis movement. Okay? And that the book was being perceived, this collection was being perceived as a resource for putting history into action, right? For belying claims that feminism is typically understood as an import, right? An imposition that comes from outside. And the thing that especially Volume 1 was able to do was to prove without a doubt that feminism is autochthonous to the Dominican Republic. Es autóctono a la República Dominicana. It's not imposed from outside. It's born inside, particularly in Puerto Plata, which I can say a word about, as part of the movement of democratization and republicanism in the DR. Secondly, that there were resources available in the country and at the AGN, as well as in places like Puerto Plata and San Pedro de Macorís, to write women's history. Okay? So something we heard again and again from K through 12 teachers, but also from teachers in higher education, educators at La UAS, at UNIBE, at PEC, INTEC, etc., Ucamaima, all the major public and private universities, was that they could see, just from perusing through the book, the possibilities for expanding their own scholarship, but also for teaching students that women have always been involved in making history in the Dominican Republic, and specifically in contesting sort of regressive and right-wing forms and patterns of violence, whether those were interpersonal or explicitly political. So we anticipate that the two volumes will inspire a great deal of writing in the news media, but also in the scholarly and educational sphere. Right. Finally, the thing that the book did was to signal transnational feminism in action. This was something that fascinated people again and again in the interviews that we did. The fact that it was two daughters of Dominicans from the U.S. and one gringa apura ceba, as she called herself, Elizabeth Manley, doing this work consistently, committedly, and unequivocally in collaboration with Dominican institutions and with Dominican feminist activists and scholars, right? Really insisting on this being a public history project, a public intellectual project, right? That it not just serve our own personal and professional agendas. So by way of example, while in the US, you don't make a lot of money from scholarly publishing. All of us who've done that in the room know that you don't get really paid, right, for the books that we publish.
You sell money.
You get 7%,
You
some
lose
royalties.
money.
But you lose money, exactly. But you get status, right? You get to use it for promotions and so on and so forth. In the Dominican Republic, the standard is that authors get paid to publish books, particularly for places like the AGN. They get some kind of honorarium, usually up front to do the work. It's a sort of research by contract, right? The three of us were very explicit from the beginning that we in no way wanted to be paid, right? Because we felt that even though we identify as Dominicans and we are the daughters of Dominicans, that our positionality as tenured or tenure track or mid-career faculty members in U.S. institutions, right, meant that we really should not be extracting resources from already vulnerable and under-resourced Dominican institutions, right? So that we explicitly forewent an honoraria for this project. And that rather we wanted them to commit to distributing the book to libraries throughout the country. Right, so that's what was written into our contract, that the money that they would have spent to pay us, that they would instead spend to make sure that the book got into the libraries that served educational purposes throughout the DR. We'll see if that happens, but that was at least the agreement. So what were some of the major findings? And I'll wrap up with that. As I said, for me personally, in the course of doing the work of documenting feminism in the 19th century, and then continuing throughout this process to work on my own book project, because that's the other thing. The three of us had our own individual projects, so we were collaborating on this as a sort of labor of love and a desessioning kind of project to return to the DR much of what had been extracted and was living in places like the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, or the New York Public Library, or the Stanford Library, or a collection at Rutgers. Those are some examples, right? Which I'll just say one thing about that. On the one hand, that's clearly messed up, right? That, for example, one of the only copies of Evangelina Rodriguez's Granos de Polen, which was her medical school thesis. Evangelina Rodriguez was the first Dominican woman licensed to practice medicine in the DR. Okay? She's an Afro-Dominican woman of impoverished circumstances. She was not a member of the elite. She was not, light enough to pass. She was explicitly una negra retinta. Okay? And she was the first woman licensed to practice medicine. She's significant historically for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is that her medical school thesis, the one that got her the scholarship to then go on to Paris and get an OBGYN advanced degree, was living at Harvard. Okay? And we have no original copy in Santo Domingo. That's a problem, right? On the other hand, it's probably because it was at Harvard that it survived, right, for over 100 years. Because of the politics of archival directorship and staffing in the DR historically. In this moment, it's pretty bureaucratized and therefore good, but that can change any time, right? So this is part of the challenge of a project like this, is that you recognize on the one hand that the national patrimony should not be living in places like the Smithsonian or Harvard or the New York Public Library. On the other hand, because it is in those powerful US hegemonic institutions, they are being preserved and they are available, right, to researchers. Here, at least. So part of what we were explicitly intending to do was to bring them back in some form or another, right, to the country. So among the things that I found then in the course of not only doing this project but continuing to work on my own was what I mentioned before, that I was always struck by the fact and considered it possibly an aberration that the women that I was learning about who were writing in newspapers and were publishing pamphlets and were corresponding with women in the US, with suffragists explicitly, from places like Puerto Plata, which is where feminism is born in the Dominican Republic, called themselves feminist. They used that word in their correspondence but also in their public publications. This caught my eye because in women's history in the US, that word is not really used until World War I. Right? The earliest documented use we have is towards the tail end of the first wave of the suffragist movement, other than by anarchist feminists who are coming largely from Italy and Russia. Okay? Those women do use the word, but even so, still early 20th century, that first decade. The Dominican women were using it by 1880 something, 83, 84, 85, 20 years before the women in the US. That's fascinating. You want to know why? They were doing it because Santo Domingo, Puerto Plata, was part of the Pan-Antillean, transatlantic, black liberation, Afro-diasporic movement. Okay? This is a port city where literally everyone from Jose Marti to Emeterio Betances to Anton Fermin to Maceo to Gregorio Luperón to Frederick Douglass to Douglass's son were interacting, corresponding, and organizing against U.S. imperialism to abolish slavery in Cuba and Puerto Rico and to promote a notion of citizenship that was general and universal. It was both political and cultural. So they were very much in conversation with the French, who had similarly radical ideas in this moment about citizenship and liberation, sectors of the French, and specifically people in Paris. Because it is in Paris that the word feminisme and féministe are coined for the first time. And so the word makes its way back to the Caribbean through that correspondence and is immediately incorporated by these Dominican women, right, who begin to use it to capture what they mean by women's place in society, what it should be, and to critique what it currently is in that moment. Which brings me to the second major finding. Feminism in the DR, although autochthonous, was always transnational, international, transatlantic, always in conversation with social movements and with women activists and thought leaders outside the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean, but also in North America and in Europe. Right? So always in this exchange of ideas. And I think that's the key. not being instructed by these other women, but in conversation with them, right? And questioning them as necessary, supporting them when they could, etc. Thirdly, and this is the last thing I'll say, well, I'll say two more things, 3 and 4. Thirdly, they very quickly developed a strategy of playing both ends against the middle, for lack of a better way of putting it. Of on the one hand, when they were in the international transatlantic sphere, for example, at meetings of the International Council of Women, they very much challenged the white women there about U.S. imperialism, about colonialism, and about racism, right? So they took those women to task, even as they wanted to collaborate with them because they understood white women as being racially and class powerful in the U.S., okay? And were much more collaborative with them than they were with Afro-American women, as far as I've been able to find so far. On the other hand, when they were in Santo Domingo or in Puerto Plata or in San Pedro, they very much played up and made visible to the male powers that be their relationships with these U.S. and European and Latin American women's and non-governmental organizations, right, by way of authorizing themselves as political actors, right, and of signaling that they had social capital and cultural capital and political capital that transcended the boundaries of their little half island. So very astute strategically. And the last thing I'll say has to do with Trujillo and where I started by actually my own project, but the conversation. It is in fact the case that Trujillo was the leader, the government official who authorized women's suffrage and women's citizenship, right? Because it was political and civil rights that were authorized in 1940 and 42. For example, things like having a cédula, right? A national identity card, which one needed to be considered an adult who could transact business in the DR. Until that moment, women were not eligible for one, including the business of voting. So what sense does a vote make under dictatorship when by definition no one's vote counts, right? And what would animate him if not simply to add women to the public spectacle of supporting the regime, which he was very much invested in? And the answer to that, really briefly, is that it wasn't just Trujillo pursuing this of his own initiative. It was Trujillo responding to the decades of women organizing for civil, political, economic rights, and beginning with the U.S. occupation of 1960 to 24 for suffrage. Ironically, it's under U.S. occupation that Dominican women begin to talk about sovereignty, citizenship, and therefore voting. So it's a response to U.S. imperialism. That's when you first see the word sufragista and a suffrage agenda emerging in the public discourse of feminists. And the rise of Trujillo in 31 offers those women, particularly under the leadership of Abigail Mejia, who was the founder of the Acción Feminista Dominicana, the possibility of wresting from the state a concession in exchange for working with and within the state as social workers, educators, public health officials, nurses, etc. All of which were also opportunities for women to professionalize, right, and enter professions that they had historically been barred from. And so it wasn't until 5 to 10 years into the regime that many of those women began to really realize what kind of bargain with the devil they were making. And by then it was too late, right? But what they did get out of it was a structure, a legislative structure, and an occupational structure that would then survive the regime and that they could draw on post-Trujillo to try and move forward a new, more actually democratic women's liberation agenda. I'll leave it there. No te convencí, Sonia.
No, I just have like 57 questions. And I don't know which one to ask first. No, the last thing you spoke about in terms of Trujillo I was just thinking of a number of parallels throughout Latin America where dictators were the ones that enfranchised women for similar reasons, and similarly the history of the women that demanded rights prior to that gets erased. Perón being a classic example, Batista being another, and so on. But in the case of Peronism in particular, it struck me that there were, I mean, I don't know if this was true also in the Dominican Republic, that there were divisions, a stark division among feminists between those who sort of supported Perón's concession of the vote and those who vehemently opposed it.
Yeah.
And opposed the concession of the vote by decree, because he decreed it. It wasn't the Congress, right? So that was, I mean, I wondered, and I think, you know, be important in terms of the larger book, but I was so impressed by this whole feat that I am just dumbfounded. That's what you're seeing in my face. It's like, wow, it would be so wonderful to have these kinds of documents available for every Latin American and Caribbean context. So that's one issue. The second issue that I wondered about is whether you all made, given that the Dominican Republic, like all of us in the Caribbean, are so profoundly transnational nations, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you made an explicit decision to exclude the diaspora, to exclude Dominicans desde aquella época who were in the United States and were involved, perhaps involved in one way or another with various strands of U.S. feminisms, or, you know, and then the third question is, to what extent, because there were, of course, in other parts of Latin America, also people calling themselves feministas at around the same time, prominently in Argentina, where the primer Congreso Feminista Latinoamericano was held in, I believe it was the end of the, right at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th.
The one that comes out of the scientific conferences.
No, it's before that. But anyway, you know, whether they were also involved with Latin American counterparts. And lastly, and it's implicit in the first question, you know, was there a working class, leftist, anarchist, non-elitist, feminist strand that and is it documented here? Are the documents for those people available? Because they tend to leave fewer documents.
Yeah. So let me see if I can remember all the questions.
So the first one was Trujillo and...
Yes. So the quick answer is yes, there were women who disagreed with that strategy. And the example of that is that the very first Dominican feminist organization is the Comité Feminista Dominicano, the CFD. And that one was founded by an Afro-Dominican woman, Petronila Angelica Gomez, who was also the publisher of the very first feminist newspaper in the Dominican Republic called Femina, which she established under U.S. occupation in 1922. She was a school teacher, again, of humble means from San Pedro de Macorís, who taught batey workers, sugarcane workers, taught sex workers, women who were sex workers, taught illiterate portsmen, because San Pedro is a port city, and worked with Evangelina, the doctor, actually on tuberculosis preventions, on handing out condoms, which was like, you know, unheard of, right, in the Parque Central of San Pedro. So very, very committed to class justice and public health initiatives and democratizing, even just like literacy, alfabetismo, right? Not even getting to like kind of more advanced literacy questions, just reading and writing and arithmetic, right? And sort of fundamental skills. So Petronila, and who was visibly black and black identified, right? Because San Pedro was also a city where black identification was more common than say La Capital, right? And she establishes the Comité Feminista Dominicano, the CFD. A woman named Elena Arizmendi, who was a Mexican feminist from Texas, from the northern Mexico-Texas border region, who was Jose Vasconcelos' lover, by the way, for 3 or 4 years, and who leaves Texas because of this relationship with Vasconcelos and goes to New York City. She was a nurse by training. In fact, she was the founder of the Cruz Blanca during the Mexican Revolution. Right? So this is a woman herself whose story is amazing.
Elena Arizmendi attends the 1922 conference in Baltimore, organized by the National Women's Suffrage Association's follow-up, which is the League of Women Voters, right, which is established right after suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these League of Women Voters, white women, have this Pan-American Women's Conference because they imagine that they're going to teach Latin American women about political rights and voting and so forth. So they organize this conference, right? And they invite mostly the elite women that they know to attend it, mostly white women from Latin America, but also some more lefty, progressive, revolutionary women, find out and make their way. Elena is one of those women. She's in New York City, she hears about the conference, she shows up in Baltimore, and she is appalled that these white suffragist women, first of all, are trying to, establish a Pan-American women's network when, as you well point out, women in Latin America had been holding congresses and organizing themselves and, promoting women's political and civil rights for decades, A. B, the U.S. was occupying several countries in Latin America at the very moment that the Pan-American Women's Conference is being held, including Haiti and the DR, right? And was trying to get Mexican oil, right? Was trying to get Mexico's oil, right? And so Elena shows up, she has a fit, she tells off the white women, and she immediately returns to New York City and establishes La Liga Internacional Interamericana Iberoamericana de Mujeres, blah, 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 feminista. She does that in New York City, where Pedro Enrique Ureña and Luis Muñoz Marín and Muna Lee are all hanging out in Lower Manhattan and Chelsea with the Hispanic cultural and political community. Pedro Enrique Ureña says to Elena, my friend Petronila Angelica Gomez has a feminist newspaper that she established in San Pedro de Macorís, and she just established a feminist organization. I think she'd love to hear about what you're doing with La Liga. So Elena writes to Petronila. Petronila writes back and says, this is fantastic, you're anti-imperialist, you're going to question the white suffragists in their attempt to school us on what feminism is and how it should be done. Count me in. So el Comité Feminista becomes una sucursal and a local site of the Liga. Therefore, it is explicitly anti-imperialist. It is explicitly democratizing of education and workers' rights. It is explicitly concerned with public health questions around disease prevention like tuberculosis through state investment in public and social welfare, right? So these are all fairly progressive agendas, right? It is explicitly working against the Catholic patriarchal narrative of sex workers as whores, right? And explicitly calling for public health investments, for worker retraining, and for holding men who hire sex workers accountable, not the workers themselves, right? So really very progressive, right? And then Trujillo happens. By the time the occupation ends, this moment between 24 and 30, when there's a jostling for power and the possibility of democratic governance in the DR, which gets immediately tossed out, it's in that moment that Abigail Mejia returns to Santo Domingo from Barcelona, where she'd been living for 30 years, basically, 20 years or so, as part of the Barcelona-Catalunya feminist world, but as a Catholic feminist. So she was much more willing to negotiate with power, right, under Primo Rivera, than, say, the Petronila Angelica Gomez's and the Evangelina Rodriguez's and the Black working class, internationalist, public health, state responsibility for social welfare kind of feminist work, right? So Abigail comes, and she's white, by the way. Abigail is, una mujer de alto boleco. She's from a white elite family, which is part of why she was in Barcelona for 20 years, right? She basically comes back and manages to very quickly displace Petronila and displace Femina, right? And establish herself as the voice of feminism among elite women, but also among educated upper middle class women with aspirations to entry into the professions and so forth, and to displace this more working class oriented progressives with an agenda, right? So much so that Trujillo appoints Abigail the director of the first museum of the Dominican Republic, the first national museum. So the answer to your question is yes, that history was there. Yes, there were possibilities there that didn't get actualized because of this transitional moment, right? And the kinds of feminisms that were more likely to be supported by certain classes. Okay. To your second question about what do we have about working class women? Very, very little. Right? It's the kind of thing that you have to find by looking at, as Teresita Martinez Viña did, police reports, for example, or municipal records, right? At the very local level to find out how are working class, poor, and rural women, because it's still also predominantly rural. I mean, by the time Trujillo assumes the power, it's 80% rural. 80% of the population lives in Los Campos, right? Only 20% are in urban centers. So working class means peasant, you know, it means campesinas, right? And
illiteracy.
And literacy, right, is non-existent.
My grandmother
and,
didn't
the
read
kinds
and write,
of class issues there are just, they're not going to be the kinds of issues that would necessarily engender a kind of organizing per se, right?
But what about the diaspora?
The diaspora is a really interesting question. So people like, the woman I start my personal book with is a woman named Mercedes Mota, who's from Puerto Plata, who, to make a very long story short, ends up leaving the Dominican Republic during the U.S. occupation with 3 or 4 of her nieces and nephews and establishes herself in the Bronx and immediately collaborates with 3 or 4 other Dominican women to establish the Comité Pro Santo Domingo de Damas to protest from here U.S. occupation and imperialism in Latin America and the Dominican Republic, right? And she goes on to continue to do her work as a feminist anti-imperialist from the U.S., from New York, and later on from New Jersey, where she moves to Cedarville. So I start my book with Mercedes Mota because she was the first Dominican feminist to attend an International Women's Congress, which was the ICW in Buffalo in 1901.
Mercedes Mota?
Mercedes Mota. And she's a fascinating figure. She's the daughter of a Chinese emigre and a Dominican woman of unknown genealogy. Not clear what her heritage, but her father was un chino que vino de China, que llegó a Cuba y después San Francisco, un chino de verdad, you know, like, and their marriage was, you know, not legitimate, right? So it was like escandaloso or whatever. But Mercedes gets identified by Emeterio Betanz's sister, Demetria, as a smart girl who should be schooled and is alfabetizada by Demetria and trained to be a teacher. So she becomes a teacher, and she's one of the first to write feminist pieces. So the long story is that, yes, there were Dominican women in New York City, for example, and Abigail in Barcelona, she would count, right, as a transnational feminist, who were very much, you know, active in Dominican women's affairs, right? Part of the story, though, is that there weren't many Dominicans outside the DR, right? Like, at any point until really 65, because before Trujillo is a small population with a handful of people elsewhere, mostly from the elites, although not exclusively, right? Between 31 and 65, it was a totally closed society. Of 4 million Dominicans, only 10,000 were outside the country. So, you know, wrap your mind around that number for a minute. 4 million people.
Even the traveling within the country didn't happen. Like, there's people from the Cibao who never went to the coast, never saw the sea, very recently.
Yeah. So, you know, you're talking about 10,000 people outside the country from 31 to 65. Like, that's nothing, right? That's nothing. That's. And half of those folks were functionaries of the regime. Half were exiles, right? So in light of that, when you keep in mind that many of those exiles were women who were organizing, by the way, to protest the Trujillada and to document its atrocities, that's really an impressive level of political engagement, right? So, yes, there were women in exile, particularly people like Carmen Natalia. I don't know if you know her stuff. We have her work here. She left the Dominican Republic in the 40s, 44, 45 during World War II. But she didn't leave before publishing in the newspaper these, you know, really like fiery, unafraid, diatribes against the regime, against Trujillo, I mean, it's like, this woman was amazing. She had no fear.
In the Listín Diario?
In El Caribe, because he had closed the Listín by then. You know, and she would publish her letters that she wrote to Trujillo himself, calling him out for firing her father and her brother and arresting her father and torturing him, and you know, that they had been asking for exit visas and they weren't being granted, and she's like, just give us the visas, we'll leave. We'll leave because you're clearly making it impossible for us to live here. And then when she left and went to San Juan, from San Juan, she wrote, you know, a tremendous amount over the next. And just as an aside about the chickens coming home to roost, so when Trujillo is ajusticiado, and as a result of that, his #1 international feminist, a woman named Minerva Renaldino, who was very much a functionary of the regime, who was one of the 4 women who signed the UN Charter for Women, who alongside Eleanor Roosevelt was at the San Francisco meeting, okay, who was the second and longest running at that point president of the Inter-American Council of Women, which was established in Havana, Cuba, right, at the Pan-American Union meeting of 28. Minerva, literally, it has been documented, was directly involved in kidnapping and assassinations in New York City, including of Galíndez, right, and the father of the Galíndez affair. Okay, this is who she was. But still very, very committed to feminism, and in particularly feminism being legislated at the level of international law through the UN. Okay, that is unequivocal. When Trujillo is assassinated,